Hi everyone and welcome back to Chess for Charity. In this video, I have a really fun and interesting challenge for you. The challenge is for you to color the pieces so that this position is legal. So it's quite the challenge. It's a logic puzzle. And if you want to give it a second, try it out. Maybe try messing with it on a physical board, or maybe in your head, write down, what pieces are what color. I'm going to go ahead and go through it and explain how to get there logically. So if you want to try it, now's your chance to pause. If not, feel free to keep watching. And while you're here, please consider subscribing. Half of the income that I earn goes directly to charity, so a simple subscription helps me out a lot. Okay, let's think about this puzzle. So the first thing that I noticed was I have two kings here, and this queen is checking both of them. Checking is kind of in quotes, right? Because it can only be really checking one of them, because the queen can only be one color. So it's checking both kings, and the same with this rook. This rook is checking both kings. And then you have to sit there and go, how in the world is that possible? And after thinking about it for a moment, maybe it's clear that it's not possible unless one condition is true. So let's just suppose for a second this queen was, I don't know, somewhere like here, and I made this move as my last move. Would that make any sense? Well, no, because that means that one of the kings would have been in check. So you can't move a queen in to give check, right? See what I'm saying? And the same thing applies to the rook. The rook couldn't have moved here because it would have been here. And if the rook is on d7, it's already giving check to this piece. And if they're already the same color, then this was giving check. See what I'm saying? So it doesn't really work. So the only way which this is true is if these two gave check at the same time. Okay, well, how does that work? How can you get like a discovered check kind of thing happening? Well, this is where the fun begins. And this is kind of the first key insight. And from here, we'll work backwards. So this queen and this rook, they coordinate on this king. Okay, so how does that make any sense? Well, imagine if there was a pawn here first. And let's say that there was a piece. I'm just going to put a pawn here just as a placeholder. And I take this pawn and promote with check like this. That's possible, right? And that's the only way, in fact, that it's possible. So from there, we can already deduce that this pawn that was on c7, that captured on d8, this was a white pawn, which means this rook is white. And the same idea with this queen. This queen is white because this is a double check, like that, right? Okay, well, if these two are white, then what does that make the black king? What does that make the king on c8? Makes it black. Okay, so we got one. We got one. So now let's think about it. Let's just keep going left. So we got this and we got this, and as a consequence of the king being black on c8, the king on d6 is white, right? Because you can't have two black kings. So let's think about this pawn, and this bishop, and this other pawn. So if this pawn were white, then what does that mean? That means that this promotion wouldn't be possible, right? This promotion I just made, because the king would have already been in check. That doesn't make any sense, right? And we know that this was the only way that happened, that promotion, like that. Which means that this pawn is black. Okay, we're getting somewhere here. But what about this bishop? It seems like in both cases, this bishop just doesn't make any sense. And this is actually one of the first things that caught my eye when I first saw this puzzle. Well, let's think about it. This bishop and this pawn have a little relationship here. If this were a black bishop, how would this pawn have stayed here? In other words, if the pawn is here and the pawn is here, right, later on, like earlier in the game, you could think about later on in the game, the idea would be the bishop has to somehow arrive there if it were a black bishop. But that doesn't make any sense because the bishop on c8, the original starting square of a black bishop, if this were black, like this is impossible because you can never get on this diagonal. You can never jump over your own pawn. which means it's impossible for this bishop to be black. Okay, that means it's a white bishop, right? And then you might ask yourself, but wait a second, how in the world does this get here? Well, it's not via the diagonal. It's not via this diagonal. Instead, it has to be a promotion. There has to be some kind of capture maybe, like this, and then promote to a bishop. Very tricky move, right? Okay, but does that help me answer the question about a7? It turns out it does. So let's make sure we understand the point here. This pawn became a bishop, right? This is a pawn promoted, which means it had to capture at some point, maybe here, who knows, maybe here, and then went up the board. It eventually had to make its way to the A file, right? That part is clear. Well, doesn't that tell me the color of this pawn? It does. And if you're not sure why, let me explain it. If this were a black pawn, then a white pawn can never get through, because how would you get a white pawn past these two blockers here? You wouldn't be able to. Instead, if this were a white pawn, you could imagine that sometime earlier in the game, I'm going to put a pawn here just to show it, maybe something like this. Maybe the pawn's here, and you capture, and you capture, and you capture. We'll assume pieces are there right now. And then you promote to a bishop, like that. And then this pawn will just make its way here later in the game. So this pawn has to be white, because if it were black, there would never be an opportunity for the bishop that got promoted to ever get to a8. Okay, you're with me so far? Isn't this really fun? It's like chess detective logic stuff. So we found out this one, this one, this one, this one, and these three. Okay, well, let's look at these two. These two aren't too bad, because our last move was promotion with double check, which means that we couldn't have been in check, right? Does that make sense? Well, if we can't be in check, then both of these pieces can't be checking us, which means they're both white. Okay, so this is correct. This is the right configuration of the colors. But you might ask yourself, and this is a good question to ask, when this pawn promoted, what did it capture? What was the position in the last move? Well, let's ask ourselves the question. Could it be a queen? Could it be a rook, a bishop, a knight? This is a really good question. So think about this position for a moment. Could it be a queen? Well, no, it couldn't be, because in order for us to capture, it means that black just made this move, because they're checking our king. But black couldn't have made this move, because any possible place that it was just on, it would have also been check. You see that? So if the queen was here and moved there, that's not a legal move, because you're already checking me, right? So it wouldn't make any sense. You see what I'm saying? Let me go back. If I put the queen here, that means it came from here. So it's my move, and then black goes queen d8. But how does that work? That wouldn't make any sense, because you're already in check. You see what I'm saying? Both of these are already attacking the king. Okay, so it's definitely not a queen. What about a rook? Oops, I had to drag that off. What about a rook? Well, no, it's the same exact idea. This rook had to move to this square in order for me to have my move. But for it to move to this square, where it was previously, d7, is already giving me check. So it couldn't be that their last move was queen d8, rook d8, because that would be still check, like this, right? Do you see the point? Okay, so it's not a rook. What about a bishop? And this is where it's just so interesting. Let's look at that. So if it's a bishop, bishop e7 is the only legal move, right? So it couldn't have gone bishop d8 and then capture to a rook, because again, this bishop right here was already checking me. So it couldn't have been this. Therefore, the only piece it could have been was a black knight, because the knight could have jumped from here or here, particularly here, because this was check. That was it, and then this was a promotion to a rook. Isn't that absolutely fascinating? But yeah, that's it for this video. And the last move, by the way, let me make sure I say that, the last move was promotion to a rook, like this, after capturing a knight. And you know that this knight came from, I would guess, e6, right? So after the knight came from e6, you captured it like this. This capture into a rook, and then this is the position with the colors correct. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please subscribe. I'm going to do a lot more of these retrogrades. They're so interesting to me. But that's it for now. Thanks so much. Bye.